Welcome to Shujin Academy VGM Club. I'm Professor Tom, your faculty sponsor. Today's opening track is New York from the arcade version of Chase HQ, composed by Takami Asano, and today's episode comes to you straight from the tough streets of a well-known crime capital, the kind of rundown inner-city hellscape run by a gang or syndicate that served as the backdrop for tons of beat-em-up games during that genre's golden age. This episode is all about music that has that gritty city feel, like you're riding a filthy subway car home and you'll probably have to stab a few people to get there. My original inspiration was to do a show that was all music from street-level beat-em-ups, but things evolved outside those constraints, and I wound up with a playlist that has the feel of those environments, even though a number of today's featured games are from categories that are quite far removed from the urban jungle. Rest assured, though, I'm definitely going to be hitting several games from the originally intended theme. For example, we're starting off our first block with Stage of Final Fight, Needle, from fighting game crossover Capcom vs. SNK for the arcade, composed by Satoshi Ise. There are several obscenities used in this song, so if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, you might want to check the timestamps and skip past it. I loved Capcom vs. SNK. I bought it for my Dreamcast because I liked Street Fighter, and it became my gateway drug into the King of Fighters franchise and Neo Geo games in general. Much like how looking at a marijuana joint eventually turned some people into full-blown junkies, I started playing Capcom vs. SNK for fun, and then I got curious and started experimenting with King of Fighters, and that led me deeper into a twisted world, and now I need to play an hour of Windjammers or Neo Turf Masters just to get out of bed in the morning. But enough about me. Let's talk about one of the most surprising games on this playlist, Putter Golf. This is a mini-golf game for the Genesis, and a review of it on defunctgames.com said, and I quote, "Putter Golf is pure garbage, period." Although I haven't played the game myself, I can't agree with the review because the soundtrack for Putter Golf is quite good. It was composed by the mysterious Fugu, and we'll be hearing the creatively named BGM 1. What song do you play after BGM 1? Why, BGM 2, of course. And that's exactly what you'll be hearing. This unoriginally named track is from Scramble Spirits, a Sega arcade shoot-'em-up that's a little like Capcom's classic 1943, but with significantly more environmental variety. I was introduced to this game and this song by Ed Wilson of the VG Embassy podcast back when I appeared on his show, and if you want to experience the joy of Ed and I talking about old Sega arcade games, I will link to that episode in the show notes. I should also mention that Scramble Spirits was composed by the team of Toru Nakabayashi and Yasuhiro Kawakami, and Kawakami's name is going to come up again a little later on this episode. The fourth song in the block is Menu from Moto Rotor 2 for the PC Engine, composed by someone known only as Opus. It's a top-down futuristic racer, but it never came out here in North America. Moto Rotor 2 has a really good soundtrack that I've featured before, so check it out if you like TurboGrafx music. The first music block doesn't just start with a song related to Final Fight. I'm actually going to use the fifth slot in the block to play a song from the original arcade classic. It'll be Metro City Subway, composed by Junko Tamiya. I couldn't do this theme without playing several songs from the Final Fight franchise, and this isn't the last track from the series you'll be hearing today. For the sixth song in the segment, we'll hear Stage Theme 03 from NES run-and-gun shooter Journey to Silius, composed by Sunsoft legend Naoki Kodaka. This game started development as a licensed game based on James Cameron's classic film The Terminator, but licensing issues caused it to become an original IP during development. Finally in the block, we'll visit another major beat-em-up franchise with Dub Slash, Round 2-1, from Streets of Rage 3 for the Genesis, composed by Motohiro Kawashima. This is quite the confrontational track, and it represents a big boss fight as we battle our way through the city to save the day. Let's throw down and hear some songs.
can spill.
Those songs were Stage of Final Fight, Needle from Capcom vs. SNK, BGM 1 from Putter Golf, BGM 2 from Scramble Spirits, Menu from Moto Rotor 2, Metro City Subway from the arcade version of Final Fight, Stage Theme 03 from Journey to Silius, and Dub Slash Round 2-1 from Streets of Rage 3. One of the things that comes to mind when I think of the streets is street racing and drift racing, and that leads us to a song called Adjustment Mind D-Course from Arcade Kart Racer Power Drift, composed by Sega's premier 80s arcade composer Hiroshi Kawaguchi. In addition to music for Power Drift in 1988, Kawaguchi also did the soundtracks for Afterburner, Space Harrier, Fantasy Zone, and a little game called Outrun. He's still active today, working for Sega and contributing to recent games in the Sonic and Monkey Ball franchises. The second song in the second block is from Comix Zone, a Genesis beat-em-up starring this episode's cover boy. If you're not familiar with this game, it stars a comic book artist named Sketch Turner who gets isekai'd into his own comic book, and in true isekai style, once sucked into the other world, he fights bad guys and falls in love with a beautiful girl. This song is from composer Howard Drossin, who's done quite a bit of secular work on films and television in addition to game music. When I played the track from Scramble Spirits in the first block, I mentioned that we'd be hearing from Yasuhiro Kawakami again, and for the third song in our upcoming block, we'll hear from Kawakami's soundtrack for Cyber Police ESWAT, a Sega arcade title that was heavily influenced by, or maybe even shamelessly copying from, RoboCop. That's okay. As Picasso said, good artists imitate and great artists steal. I was not expecting to play songs from a tennis game on this episode, but the soundtrack for ATP Tour Championship Tennis for the Genesis came along and surprised me with a song called Bracket Results, and it fit perfectly. Composer Hikoshi Hashimoto made the YM2612 sound chip do some really cool stuff for this game, and there's actually another song from it in the next block. Sticking with Sega games, our fifth song in the block is Ninja Soul from Shinobi 3, Return of the Ninja Master for the Genesis, coming from the team of Masayuki Nagao, Hirofumi Murasaki, and Morihiko Akiyama. I have played songs from this game multiple times before because it has a fantastic soundtrack chock full of ninja magic. We'll revisit the Final Fight franchise for the sixth song in the block. It'll be Creeping Weeping from Final Fight 2 for the Super Nintendo. Just like the original arcade Final Fight, this game featured a whole bunch of composers from Capcom's bullpen, namely Yasuaki Fujita, Mari Yamaguchi, Yuki Iwai, Setsuo Yamamoto, Yuko Takahara, and Tatsuya Nishimura. Unlike the anemic SNES port of the first game, this game featured two-player co-op and included more than two enemies on screen at once. The secret seventh song in the block comes from Lam-Mal, and it might actually be the first Sharp X68000 game that I have ever featured on the show. The name of the song is Town B, and the composers are Hideaki Takashita and Ryu Takami, and I only heard this soundtrack through the valiant efforts of my bro Ragecage, who devoted an entire episode of his podcast VG Emporium to talking about it and the work it took to get a clean rip of it. I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes. We will once again close out a block with a big confrontation with a song called Boss 1 from Taito arcade game Night Striker, composed by Masahiko Takaki. This is a game about piloting a futuristic hovercraft through a city, and Takaki's soundtrack has a lot to like about it. Someone out there really must be into this game, because more than 35 years after its original release, it's getting a sequel for the Switch soon. Time to hit the streets with some tunes. Those songs were Adjustment Mind, D-Course from Power Drift, Episode 2, Page 1-2 from Comic Zone, BGM 01 from Cyber Police ESWAT, Bracket Results from ATP Tour Championship Tennis, Ninja Soul from Shinobi 3 Return of the Ninja Master, Creeping Weeping from Final Fight 2, Town B from Lam-Mal, and Boss 1 from Night Striker. It's time for a word from our sponsor. Today's episode of Shujin Academy VGM Club is brought to you by Axel & Cody's Plumbing Supply Company. The durability and value of a good metal pipe is unsurpassed when it comes to your bathroom renovation, and Axel & Cody have years of experience with metal pipe for a variety of projects both large and small. Visit ancplumbingsupply.com today and use promo code LAYSOMEPIPE to get 15% off your first order. Now, back to the show. To start off our third block, we'll go to the third game in the Final Fight series. The song is Law and Disorder from Final Fight 3 for the Super Nintendo, and it was composed by Katsunari Kitajima. Unlike the previous two Final Fight games, which were composed by teams of Capcom music legends, Kitajima was the only composer for this soundtrack. Cool fact about this game, it's one of the more valuable Super NES carts. Copies of it go for over $100. Moving on to song number 2, it'll be First Floor Underground Classic from the Dark Spire for the Nintendo DS, composed by Kenichi Arakawa. The Dark Spire is a first-person dungeon crawler heavily influenced by the original Wizardry games, and it can be played in either modern mode or classic mode. Modern mode used the DS hardware for presentation stuff, but classic mode turned all of the graphics into wireframes like you would have seen in early generation PC RPGs. I can't speak to the gameplay, but Arakawa's soundtrack is really good, and even though you're exploring a dungeon, this particular song feels like walking through a neon-lit street at nighttime. Our third song in the block is Stage 1,4,6 from Abadox, The Deadly Inner War, a NES game composed by Kiyohiro Sada. We actually heard from Sada on our last episode, as he worked on featured game Biomiracle Bokute Upa during his time at Konami. After Sada left Konami, he went to Natsume, where he composed this game and some others before forming his own music company in 1993. Abadox is a shoot-'em-up, and just like Konami's Life Force, this game is about a lone pilot infiltrating a giant living organism that's been corrupted by evil. It features both horizontally and vertically scrolling stages, but unusually, Abadox's vertically scrolling levels have you progressing down instead of up. Block 3, Song 4, takes us to the Commodore 64 and composer Jeroen Tel's soundtrack for Myth, History in the Making. The song name is Loading Tune, and I love how it sounds. I don't play a lot of C64 stuff on this show because I did not own one growing up, and thus it holds no nostalgic value for me, but I have heard some really good stuff from Jeroen Tel's work on the system. Moving from the Commodore 64 to another platform whose name ends in an integer, we'll visit the PC-98 with a track called Striker from Blackbird, Toritachi no Tuboi, written by a mysterious unknown composer. This game is a sci-fi dungeon crawler, which is a genre that has a little bit of representation on the PC-98, and it's also an adult game, which is a genre that has a lot of representation on the PC-98. The soundtrack is excellent, and I wish I knew who composed it so I could look them up and hear more of their stuff. This episode has featured a lot of arcade games in general, and several from Sega in particular, and our sixth song in the block is from yet another one. The game is Alien Syndrome, and the song is Unknown 03, and it was composed by Toru Nakabayashi. Although this isn't a game set in a city, it is a game about characters fighting to survive in a very hostile environment, so it's no surprise that this track fits right into today's theme. The seventh song in the block is Enemy Base from Ninja 5-0 for the Game Boy Advance, a game that is quite rare in that physical copies are very difficult to find, but also quite rare in that it was developed in Japan by a Japanese team, but only released in North America and Europe. The game's European title was Ninja Cop, which sounds like a direct-to-video action movie from the 80s, and its soundtrack was composed by Aya Tanaka and Hiroyuki Sugobuchi. For the penultimate song in the block, we'll be building to a climactic encounter with our final boss by hearing Unused Song 2 from Mario's Super Picross for the Super Famicom, composed by Toshiyuki Ueno. I was as surprised to see this game show up on today's playlist as I was surprised to see our very last game, which is a return to ATP Tour Championship Tennis for the Genesis, once again composed by Hikoshi Hashimoto. The song is sound test number 5, and I have no idea why it got put in a tennis game when it is obviously an end-boss battle theme. Let's kick some ass and take some names. Those songs were Law and Disorder from Final Fight 3, First Floor Underground Classic from The Dark Spire, Stage 1,4,6 from Abadox, Loading Tune from Myth, History in the Making, Striker from Blackbird, Toritachi no Tuboi, Unknown 03 from Alien Syndrome, Enemy Base from Ninja 5-0, Unused Song 2 from Mario Super Picross, and finally, Sound Test number 5 from ATP Tour Championship Tennis. That's the show. If you want to reach me, I'm most active on Blue Sky as shujinacademy.bsky.social. You can also find me on Threads, Tumblr, or Instagram as Shujin Academy VGM Club. All episodes of the show are posted to my YouTube channel, which you can find by searching for Shujin Academy VGM Club. Links to everything are available on my Linktree at linktr.ee/Shujin Academy. Please leave me a 5-star rating on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you're finding this episode. New episodes are released once or twice a month, depending on how often I get them done, and they premiere on Thursday mornings on your favorite podcatcher and on 8beats.co, the internet's #1 game music radio station. My show is also featured on TerraPlayer, the cool app that's a destination for gaming podcasts and other content, so you can check me out there. Finally, if you just can't get enough of me, I'm also voicing esports reporter Samson Escapades on audio drama How Much in Bison Dollars, which you can hear on Spotify and FGC Radio. Speaking of Spotify, if you're listening there, please be aware that they've pulled a few of my episodes before. There is a non-zero chance they'll eventually pull my entire podcast, as they've done with a few other game music podcasts, so I'd strongly suggest you subscribe elsewhere to be sure you can get all the Professor Tom goodness you crave. Special thanks for this episode goes out to fellow VGM podcaster Jameson of Bar Silence Podcast for contributing cover art. You can and should find Bar Silence wherever you download podcasts, and check out his website at barsilence.com. Special thanks also goes out to Drew Mackey, host of Singing Mountain, which was a VGM podcast that strongly inspired me to start this show. Drew made a trilogy of episodes about urban environments, and I'll link to all 3 of them in the show notes. I've got one more song to play us out, and it seems only right that our gritty tale of urban vengeance closes with a song that feels end credits-y. It is not actually an end credits theme, though. It's main theme of Streets of Rage 4, and it is unsurprisingly from Streets of Rage 4, and it was composed by the incomparable Yuzo Koshiro. Thanks for listening. I'm Professor Tom, and I'll see you next time on Shujin Academy VGM Club.